Our parable today is about fear, or better yet, letting go of our fear. A guy's going on a trip. He calls his slaves in to help him take care of his property while he's gone, and it just so happens that part of his property is a monstrous pile of cash. On September 11th, we learned about a talent. One talent in ancient Israel was a lot of money. It was equal to 15 years of a laborer's wages, or about $450,000 in 2011 dollars. So this is a lot of money. So this guy who's going on the trip gives one slave 5 talents, or $2.25 million. Another slave 2 talents, or $900,000. And then the third slave 1 talent, or $450,000. And then he leaves. Doesn't give them any instruction on what to do. No clues, preferences as to how he'd like his money handled. He just goes. Gotta go. See ya. How would you feel if you were someone's slave, if you were owned by someone, and then you were told to take care of their property and at least $450,000 for a while? That's a pretty vulnerable situation to be in. Someone hands me a check for $450,000. I hold it like this. My parents, a few years ago, sold their house in Sioux Falls, and the bank handed them a check. And then they drove with the check following the moving van to the Quad Cities. And it was the most nerve-wracking trip of their lives. They're driving along, don't hit anybody, don't let anybody hit me, don't spill coffee on the check. You know? I think we can understand the fear of the slaves being given this sort of responsibility. They don't want to mess this up. Their fear is real. Well, the 2 slaves who are given $2.25 million and $900,000 either aren't afraid, or they get over their fear very quickly, because they go straight to the trading floor and they start wheeling and dealing with this money. We don't know exactly what they're doing. They might be buying sheep low, selling sheep high. They might be finding a good deal on salt. They might be doubling down on lucky sevens. But whatever it is, they double their money. They double their money. They clearly have skills in money management. We wonder why they're slaves. But back home is slave number 3. He's still standing there holding this check for $450,000. We don't know the whole story here. Could be there's an economic crisis going on. Could be both the empires of Greece and Rome are in the midst of a debt crisis. They might be about to fold. Everyone might be losing their shirt. That might be the word on the street. Can't put your check in the bank account because you earn 0.00001% interest. Nothing good's going to happen there. It's time to keep cash on hand, perhaps. The only thing he can think of to do to be safe, because he doesn't want to mess this up, the master's mean, is to put the check in the ground. And so he digs a hole, puts the check in, covers it up, pats it down, and waits. Well, eventually the master comes back and calls the slaves forward. Slave number 1 comes forward and says, you gave me $2.25 million. Here's $2.25 million more. And the master says, hey, that's what I like to see. Good and faithful slave, I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master, he says. The second slave comes forward and says, you gave me $900,000. Here's $900,000 more. And the master says, hey, that's my guy. Put you in charge of many things too. Enter into the joy of your master. Well, slave number 3 goes to the hole, digs up the check, brings the check for $450,000, hands it to the master. The first thing he says is, I was afraid. I was afraid. The master is angry, takes the 1 talent, splits it among the other 2, and then casts slave number 3 into the outer darkness, which is pretty harsh. We can understand this slave's fear, but out he goes. The main message of this parable is don't be like slave number 3. And the parable isn't really about money management. we can't sort out how to wheel and deal with our investments because of this parable. And this parable is about God's generosity, God's gifts, and how we are to put them to use. God is generous. God gives us gifts, abundant gifts. Some of those gifts can be turned into wealth. We use them to earn a living. And some of those gifts have absolutely nothing to do with anything that might earn a profit. But God gives all of us varied and important gifts. Our job is to put those gifts to use. Our job is to let go of our fear, claim the gifts God has given us, and then put them to use. In Rob Bell's book, Love Wins, that we've been talking about, and many of you have been reading, he says that hell is refusing to trust. Hell is refusing to trust. And refusing to trust is often rooted in a distorted view of God. Now, in our story, the master is really God, which is as imperfect as that image of God is. The master is representing God. And I think as I read through the story, the differences between slave 1 and 2 and slave 3 is how they see God, is their view of God. Slave 3 sees God, or reality, as mean, as shrewd, and he's afraid because of that. But slaves 1 and 2 ultimately see God, see reality as generous. The master's giving them an opportunity for something new, for something better. And because of how they see God, the master, reality as generous, they're able to let go of any fear they have and to put gifts to use. There is plenty in life that is hard and heartbreaking. Our heartbreak can easily lead to deep fear. If we've been hurt in the past, if we've lost something or someone important to us in the past, we will likely do anything we can to avoid feeling that hurt or pain in the future. If someone told us that we weren't good enough or that our gifts were no good, it's understandable that we'd be afraid of experiencing that hurt again. It's so easy to let this fear take over us and to bury our talents, bury our gifts. I think Rob Bell is right that being gripped by this fear, being held back by this fear, is a hell of sorts. It also comes from a failure to trust that God is loving, that God is generous, that God has indeed entrusted us, each and every one of us, with amazing gifts that the world needs us to put to use. It's not just the gold medal winners in the Olympics who are gifted. It's not just Steve Jobs who are gifted. It's not just the success stories in the magazines that are showing us gifted people. It's not just the youngsters who have their futures ahead of them who have important gifts that matter. The Christian faith invites us to trust a different story. We are to believe that God is generous, that we are talented in our own ways because God has entrusted us with gifts, and our gifts matter in all seasons of our lives. This belief helps us leave fear behind. Rob Bell would say we step out of hell and we join slave 1 and 2 in experiencing the joy of the Master, in experiencing the joy of God. I recently watched the movie The King's Speech again. I highly recommend this movie. The best movie on English royalty I've seen in a long, long time. The film tells the story of the Duke of York becoming King George VI, King of England, as World War II is beginning. And the Duke of York, whose family calls him Bertie, has a severe speech impediment. He's afraid of public speaking for good reason, because it's humiliating for him. And he's terribly afraid of becoming king because it will involve more public speaking and more humiliation. His wife, the Duchess of York, has arranged for him to see all sorts of doctors, but none of the treatments are working for him. Finally, she arranges a meeting with a commoner from Australia named Lionel Logue. And Logue has no credentials and a controversial approach that involves a strict rule of equality with all of his patients, whether that person is a child or the Duke of York. And his approach involves essentially psychology, talking about the past, talking about fear, and trying to uncover fear and hurt. because he believes that that's ultimately what's behind speech impediments. So Logue becomes Bertie's speech therapist. There's an important scene just after Bertie's father, the King George V, dies, where Bertie comes to Lionel Logue, and Bertie starts to share some of what happened to him in his childhood. He tells Logue that his father's dying words were, "Bertie has more guts than the rest of his brothers put together." And then he says, "But my father could never tell me that to my face." Logue asked if his brothers ever teased him, and Bertie replied, "Oh, yes, of course, Bertie," they would say. And then my father would encourage it. He'd say, "Get it out, boy." He told me that would help me stop. Logue asked Bertie if he's naturally right-handed because he's dealing with something rather clumsily. And he says, "No, I was left-handed naturally, but I was punished, and so I switched." And Logue replies that this is very common with stammerers, being corrected in some way, being told that who they naturally were wasn't good, it wasn't right. "Any other corrections?" he asks. "Knock knees," Bertie replies. "Metal splints were made that I wore day and night, and it was agony." And then he shares that his first nanny didn't like him as well as his brothers, and his first nanny would pinch him when it was time for the daily viewing, so that when he was handed over to his parents, he would be crying, and they would hand him back to them very quickly. And then he said, "And she wouldn't feed me." It took them 3 years for them to figure it out. And then he shared that his brother, who was 13, died, and he was very close to that brother. He says, "You're the first common man I've ever talked to about this." And Logue says, "Well, what are friends for?" And Bertie says, "I wouldn't know." As he shares his story, you see heartbreak after heartbreak, humiliation after humiliation piling on the shoulders of this young boy. And you can see why he would feel like he was no good. And you can see how the stuttering would start and how the fear would run so deeply in him. Well, soon, through a strange turn of events, Bertie's brother, who was on the throne, gives up the throne, and Bertie becomes king, and he's terrified. He's overwhelmed with fear, and he can't speak, barely at all. He says, "I'm not a king." But Logue helps him, mostly by being a friend. Logue confronts him, telling him he doesn't have to be governed by fear. Logue tells him he no longer needs to be afraid of the things he was afraid of when he was 5. Logue tells him he has such perseverance, and he's the bravest man that he knows. He says, "You'll make a very good king." And then the king has to make a speech to tell the nation that they are at war. And with his friend standing at his side, coaching him through it, he delivers it well. Through the love of this friendship, Bertie, the king, starts to believe different things about himself. That he's gifted, that he has courage, that he has perseverance, he has intelligence, he has wisdom, he has the right qualities of leadership for this time of crisis in his country. And because of love, because Bertie's been given the gift of believing different things about himself, he shares his gifts to become a critical leader for England at a critical time. The love of his friendship allows him to believe that he had gifts to share, and he steps out of hell in which his fears, the hell that his fears had trapped him in, and he starts to live with confidence and joy. It's love that allows him to do this. Our passage for today encourages us to trust that God is love, that God loves us enough to be generous with us. This generous God gives us valuable gifts, all of us valuable gifts. Gifts we are called to recognize, gifts we are called to share in every season of our lives. We don't need to fear. We don't need to hide what we do well. We shouldn't dismiss our gifts as unimportant just because the world may not value them. God is love. God is generous. God has gifted each of us with important gifts that we are to use and to share. Don't be afraid. Be who you are. The world needs you. We need you, for you carry gifts of God. Thanks be to God. Amen.